Well, hello, everybody. I am re-releasing this episode with the Good Morning girls, Sal and Im. I adore these two. They have the best podcast. The Good Morning Grief podcast is one of my favorites. It's really good for people, obviously, that have lost somebody. And they actually have a new book that has come out. And I know that that's going to be released in the United States in the upcoming months. And I'm such a fan of theirs. So why not re-release this episode? Their book is called Good Mourning, Mourn hyphen ing, Sally, Douglas and Imogen Carn. And I am excited to read this book. They sent it to me and it will be released in May in the States. And like I said, I'm a big fan of them both. Before you listen to this episode, please take some time, if you can, and you like the podcast and you listen every week, to head over to Apple or Spotify, wherever you listen, and leave me a quick review. It's always appreciated. It's super easy. It takes 1 minute to do. Hopefully you're following the show and you can leave me a quick review. I also have episodes that are going to be up on Patreon, so you can join Patreon. And as always, love you guys, love your support. And here is my episode with Sal and Im from the Good Morning podcast. We've all been put here for a reason, and we all deserve acceptance.
Judging Meghan with Meghan Judge.
I'm a trauma survivor from a really young age, and I have been diagnosed with complex PTSD in the past few years. I've been surrounded by death and abuse much of my life. I've been dragged through the mud and have been to the point of not wanting to go on anymore. Through my interviews with other survivors, I've learned that there is a way out. From recovering to surviving and thriving, we all have the strength to come out the other side.
You are listening to Judging Meghan.
Hi, everyone. You are listening to Judging Meghan with your host, Meghan Judge. You know, usually I start the podcast with a funny story before I go into the things that can be really serious that I talk about. And I will tell you that the most recent shooting has kept me up for the past. It happened like 2 days ago from when I'm recording. I have been up and I was terrified. I didn't want to send my kids to school the other day. I drove in the parking lot and I thought for a second about not letting them get out of the car because I was so upset about this. My two guests are coming on today. They are not American. They have fabulous accents. I can already tell I'm going to be obsessed with them, but I'm going to tell you, I would like their opinions on this because this is not happening in other countries. And me being a mental health advocate and all about mental health awareness and doing everything I can to break the stigma on mental health, there should be laws in place to protect citizens, especially young children that are supposed to be able to go to school safely and be dropped off by their parents, and they shouldn't be killed at school. So I am going to introduce you to Sally Douglas and Imogen Carn, known as Sal and Im, and they are both also podcasters. Their podcast is called Good Morning Podcast, which, by the way, is the best name for a podcast I've ever heard because mourning, listen to this, is not spelled like morning. It is spelled like mourning, like Mourn. So I thought that was pretty good. How are you both doing, first of all?
Hey, Meghan. It's so nice to join you today, and we are doing okay. Thank you.
Hi, Meghan. Im here. We are in Australia at the moment, and it's, lovely to be on your podcast.
Okay, but I also want to tell you, I want to have your accents, which I said before we recorded. They're so cool. I just hate having the accent that I do, and then I talk to you, and I'm like, God, we really have bad accents in the States.
You've got a great accent.
No.
I like your accent.
Stop it.
I love listening to American podcasts. I love it.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah.
Really? Okay. Well, I hate to I'll get your opinions on this because I know you don't want to get political. I don't even want to get political. And that's the thing that stinks. But I'm a mom and I'm all about protecting my babies. And I think everybody is. And for us not to be able to feel safe, and there's been 288 schools that have been affected by these shootings since Sandy Hook and Columbine, something needs to change. So I wanted to ask you both, because you live outside of the States and you don't have these problems in Australia. Can you give me your 2 cents on your thoughts on this?
As a mum as well, and as someone who's experienced a violent loss, I felt absolutely devastated for the families when I heard the news. And I don't think, we will never know the specific pain and trauma that the families in the community of Uvalde are going through. But when you experience loss, I think it does increase your empathy for others who are navigating such an impossible thing. And I think the grief was felt collectively across the globe, and our hearts just go out to everyone who is impacted by this tragic event. It's absolutely terrifying. And I think, we could sit here and say, I can't imagine, but we can imagine. I think we could imagine what that's like, being terrified to send your child to school. And we're so sorry that you guys are going through that.
No, I appreciate that. I think that it's, in the world, these are moments when people need to reach out and help each other and exchange ideas. And no matter where you stand politically in the United States, I'm going to talk about, this shouldn't be a political issue. This should be a human issue. And I think that no matter where you live in the world, I would hope that people feel the same way. So I'm just going to change the subject. And I would like to go into, I've first of all never interviewed two people at the same time. So this is a first for me. Welcome.
You'll be great. We'll try not to talk over each other. But
I kind of feel like we're in the Brady Bunch right now, like in the squares. Did you ever see the Brady Bunch?
Yeah.
And you're looking up at, okay, so that's how I feel. But let's talk about why you both started the podcast. I know that you've both gone through your own fair share of trauma and grief, and hence why you started a podcast in COVID as well. I started in 2020 as well. So I think we both are on the same page. We're both on the same avenue about what we're trying to do and helping other people and normalizing mental health. So why don't we start there?
Absolutely. I think we started our podcast in September 2020. So I think it was a similar time to you.
Yeah.
So a bit about our story. So Im and I, we both lost our mums when we were in our early 30s. So I'll let Im sort of tell her story. But my story is my mum died suddenly. She died by something called SUDEP, which stands for sudden and unexpected death in epilepsy. She was healthy. She had epilepsy, but it was never anything that was life-threatening for her. And she had a sudden prolonged seizure. And I woke up one morning and I got a phone call at 6 a.m. to say, your mum's passed away. And I found myself on a flight 6 a.m. the next morning, flying back to the UK, where I'm originally from, to deal with the death and sort her estate out. And the grief was incredible. It was just such a deep shock. I think you don't expect to lose somebody so close to you suddenly. We're not prepared for it. And I certainly didn't expect to lose my mum in my early 30s. And then, my grief was overwhelming. And I came to meet Imogen through a support group. I'll let Im sort of tell her story and the kind of story of how we came to meet. But our kind of how we came to be was grounded in sudden loss and the shock of that.
Well, number one, I'm going to let you speak as well, Im, but I'm so sorry to hear that. It's awful. And I don't think as humans, we all know it's part of life, right? Sadly, my husband just lost his mom literally over the weekend. And it was sudden loss, awful, didn't expect it. And I'm dealing with the beginning stages of his grief. And even though I've walked those streets, I like to say before, I'm sure you both feel this way. You just don't, in some ways you don't want to be reminded. It's like the worst thing to know that somebody else is going through it, and never knowing the right thing to say or do is another part of it. But I am so sorry to hear that. But I want to hear what happened with you, Im, as well.
Yeah, it was very sudden and very traumatic for me. So I was a new mom. I had a 9-month-old baby at the time, my daughter Layla, and my mum took her own life. And it was something that I could never have even imagined, like, being an option for her. Like, she is the last person on this earth that I could have ever imagined doing something like that. And I've learnt the hard way that suicide doesn't discriminate. It can happen to anyone. She was going through, I think, what is called circumstantial or situational depression. So she didn't suffer from any previous mental health issues. It was just literally her circumstances had changed. She was going through a really awful situation and she couldn't see a way forward. And it was just absolutely devastating. And I've just tried to rebuild my life ever since, and it's been just over 2 years now, and it's been really hard. But meeting Sal has changed my life in so many ways, and having Good Mourning to focus on has been like life-saving for me, and just being able to help other people going through loss has just been such a gift. So as Sal mentioned, we met through our loss. So we met through a support group called Motherless Daughters, and we weren't really support group type of people. Like, I feel like we have mates and we have a good support network, but I think we really craved a connection with someone who could really understand what we were going through and relate to, that was outside of our family. And we met, and it was just like this instant connection. And we often say that we feel like our mums brought us together, like making it happen. So I always say to Sal, like, she's literally like my mom's perfect ideal child. Like, so many things of her are the same as my mom's. They got similar hobbies, and like, yeah, I just feel like if my mom were to put somebody in my life to do grief with, it would be Sal. So I really feel like she's been such a gift for me through all of this.
And likewise. And it's so lonely, grief, when you're going through grief, any kind of loss. Even if you have a support network around you, it can sometimes still feel really isolating. And I think that's what Im and I both felt like. We have mates, we have family members, but there's a loneliness because you can feel lonely when you have people that don't connect with what you're experiencing. And that's what we both felt. I think sometimes people equate loneliness with thinking that you don't have any friends or any support. But I think when you're going through a loss, we were in our early 30s. None of our peers had really had experienced sudden loss on the level that we had. So we just really craved that connection, somebody that understood the shock, the pain, the grief, the trauma. And that's what brought us together. And when you just vibe with someone, you've probably had it, Meghan, right? Where you just vibe, and we kind of had that connection. So we started meeting up for coffees and wines and talking about grief. And, we would chat about what was going on for us. Are you going through this? Oh, my God, yes, me too. All of those kind of the little things that I think sometimes when you're grieving, you sit there and wonder, is it just me? Is this normal? Should I be feeling this way? Is it normal to have all these million emotions in like one day? And Im and I just connected on so many levels. And we kind of said, surely there must be so many people who are grieving and are feeling lonely too. And like we were talking about earlier, we were just coming off the back of like the first lockdown, the first wave of the pandemic, and grief was kind of a little bit more at the forefront for a lot of people. So we were kind of like, what can we do to help other people going through this? Because I think it's not until you're in grief that you realize how little we talk about it, or how people just shuffle around the subject and feel super awkward. Yeah. It's one of those things, right? And I'm sure you found it with the topic of trauma as well. Like, it's like people just don't know what to say. So that's kind of how the idea for Good Mourning was born. Like, let's start a platform where we can talk about the taboo topics, but in a way, like you, Meghan, that has a bit of humor in it, because you kind of need a bit of humor to get you through the dark times.
I feel like, number one, I'm so sorry for your story. I don't know if you know this, but part of why I started this podcast is because I was suicidal several years ago. And mine was also trauma, like based from my early childhood. Like I had major PTSD from some events that took place, but also situational. And so one of the most important things for me as a podcaster, as somebody that has a platform that people actually listen to, which is always shocking to me, is to normalize talking about your feelings, depression, and also like people don't talk about being suicidal. It's like embarrassing. It's like, oh my God, she's crazy. Like, no, I'm not crazy. I wasn't crazy. I went through a really freaking shitty situation. It sounds like your mom was in a bad situation. And sometimes people feel like there's no way out, and and like, sadly, it's the worst kind of pain to feel that way. And I felt that, like, where I was obsessed with it and I couldn't stop thinking about it. And so I'm so sorry to hear that, because the trauma that it has caused you and, people that take their own lives are almost made to be villains and selfish and all of these things. And it's not fair, that, number one, because to be in the amount of pain that you're in and feeling that way, nobody can understand unless they have been there. I'll say that.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you're here today. Thank you for being here today and for sharing your experience and being so open and honest about it, because you never know who that's going to help, because people don't talk about this sort of stuff openly. So, yeah, I'm glad that you're here.
No, they don't. And it's like we have so many cases recently, like Naomi Judd, for example, or that beauty queen, or the suicide rates have like skyrocketed since COVID. And and the more that people talk about it, and you share about your mom, and it's not like you're some kind of like crazy villain or bad or whatever society puts on people that go through this or have encountered the feelings or the thoughts or lost somebody to it. It's unfair. It's all unfair. It's all unfair.
Yeah.
And then the second thing I wanted to say is I am so jealous, because to be able to have the gift, which I believe your mothers did, because I'm all about signs and stuff and spiritual. And I believe they probably did put you together, and to have somebody to be in that exact spot in the grieving process, like I've grieved in my own life. My grieving took place with my best friend many years ago. And I haven't, knock on wood, had a loss like you have in recent years, but I also don't want to be reminded of it. So like this little reminder we've had with my husband, and he's in the very beginning stages of it. People it's almost like you don't remember and you don't want to remember. Does that make sense? So to have somebody by your side, because you never know, like you don't want to say the wrong things in front of your kids or your family, or you might burst out crying, or you might put a bra in the dishwasher by an accident, or, like all the things that you do. I just have to tell you how amazed I am by both of you, and what a gift it is to go through that together and then turn it around and start the podcast and do what you're doing. You're my kind of gals. You really are.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That means a lot.
Sure. So tell me more about why you, I hate to like separate it, and it's difficult to like tell each story, but when you both met and you were in this like process of the very beginning stages of grieving, how did you even meet, and like what did you talk about? And if I have listeners, which I know I do, that might be in the beginning stages of losing someone, what is your advice for telling people what to do or where to go? Like, how did you even know to find motherless daughters? Like, tell me a little bit about that.
Gosh, thinking back, it's like kind of a blur. Like I don't even know what we talked about.
Yeah.
We'd talk for hours and hours and hours about grief. So lots of fun us. But I think me personally, I was desperate to find anything that was going to give me the, slightest feeling of like hope or peace or understanding. I was always on the internet Googling things in the middle of the night. Like I just, I was buying all the books, just doing everything that I could to try and get help because I felt like I couldn't survive what I was going through. And I came across this support group through a book called Motherless Daughters, which is by Hope Edelman. And so that's how I found the support group, just online Googling all night. But it's really hard to find resources that related to us. Like we struggled. And I think that was, one of the big reasons why we created Good Mourning, because there's a lot of literature out there, but a lot of it didn't really resonate with us. Like we wanted to hear people our age going through what we were going through and like talking about all the elements of grief. Like you mentioned before, putting a bra in the dishwasher or whatever, like the grief brain fog, I can't even say it properly, that can come with grief and the exhaustion and all of those things. And I think that's what Sal and I talked about all the time, is just how horrendous we felt and like how just out of body it felt sometimes. And it was just so good to have someone that could relate, to all of those things. And we just, talk about that for hours and hours.
And what was it like, Sal, for you, like going through, you found this support group, and you met each other. And it is, what's really wild is women like can be such freaking nightmares. Like I've gone through like the worst friend breakup and dealt with like the bitchiest. Sorry, I cuss on this podcast sometimes. The bitchiest.
We do too, don't worry.
Okay, well I have to. Like women can be so awful to one another. Like just tear each other to pieces. Not care. I don't know what it is. I'm still trying to figure out. I have 2 daughters and I'm like, oh God, you're going through what I went through. I don't wish that upon anyone. But we also have the ability to like be so caring and nurturing and kind to each other. Like not every woman is like that, but there are so many great women. And then when you find your kind, especially like it sounds like you both touched on and obviously are so close now, that bond is so tremendous and special. Do you know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. Im and I, like our friendship is one of those like, there's only a few of them that you have in life, those friendships where it's like instant, there is like a soul deep connection. Like Im and I have had really similar journeys in our lives. Some of the things, it's like we lived parallel lives when we were growing up. Like the trajectory of our lives were so similar and we had so many things in common. It was just weird. We were like, this is so odd that, we're so similar and we've had similar losses. It was like we were meant to be friends. And I think that it's rare to find that friendship where you develop such a deep connection so quickly, but it is one of those like for life friendships. And, I feel just so grateful that we have each other, like you said earlier, to be able to go through this process together, because it is rare and it is such a gift.
I can't imagine Sally not being in my life now. It's so strange. And you'll love this, Meghan, but I spoke to a guy years ago who has psychic abilities, and this only came up recently and it's so good. But he kind of read me years ago when we were away on a holiday, and he said to me, and he only reminded me of this recently, I'd completely forgotten, but when he read me, he said to me, something is going to happen and a woman is going to come into your life and change everything. And I was like, I'm not that way inclined. Like, I'm very much happy.
So.
Yeah. And I was like, I just can't imagine what this could possibly be. So I think I just shelved it and never thought of it again. And then he messaged me recently and he was like, oh, I just was watching some story that you did on Instagram and it just made me remember what I'd said to you about a woman coming into your life and like changing everything. And I was like, holy shit, it's Sal. And I couldn't have imagined like how or why, but yeah, he picked that up psychically years before everything had even happened.
And actually,
I believe in all
Meghan,
that stuff, by the way. I go to my psychic, Tim Braun, who's been on. He's a medium and a psychic. And he's told me like unbelievable stuff. And he's like very rarely wrong. And I think like going through the losses that I've gone through too, like I lost my very best friend. She was my sister. She was like you both are probably. And
so sorry.
She was my... And you know what's interesting too is I don't know if I believe in past lives or I don't know how I feel on that stuff, but I do believe that people come into your life and you have soulmates, and that could be friends, that could be like husbands or wives or whatever it is. There's something that like you're drawn to with another human being. And like I say that Julie, who's my best friend that's in heaven, she was my soulmate, and I believe that. And I think that's true. And that can be true for, you know, you have one loss in life, which was sadly your mom's, but they probably had something to do, or JC, I believe in Jesus Christ, the man upstairs. Who knows what it is, you know, and whatever you believe, but there can't be coincidences like this. Right? Am I wrong on that? Am I crazy?
No, you're right.
No, you're absolutely right. And actually, Im, there's that story we should tell Meghan about the psychic. So a couple of like signs that we've had, if you're into this stuff, because we're really into it as well. And we talk about it quite a lot on our pod. My mum was called Rose. Im's mum was called Vanessa. And Im and I met at a pub in Sydney here in Australia, and it was called the Rose Hotel, right? That's my mum's name. But then there was another wild story, Im, you tell it really well, that we were just like, this is weird. This has to be some sort of sign.
So my sister sees psychics as well. She's well into that stuff like we are. And she saw a woman, and the woman said to her, your mum is with somebody called Rose or Rosa, or you know, I can't quite figure it out. And my sister's like, I don't know, like probably she brushed it away because she didn't know Sally's mum's name or anything. And then we were having lunch on Sally's mum's birthday. Me and Sal were having lunch, and my sister called. And I usually don't answer the phone when I'm with someone having lunch, but I just picked up the phone anyway. And she was like, what are you up to? And I said, I'm just having lunch with Sal. It's her mum's birthday today. And she said, what's her mum's name? I said, it was Rose. And she's like, holy shit, Im. I was like, what? She goes, something's just clicked. I was like, what? She goes, do you remember when I saw that psychic and they said that mum was with somebody called Rose, like saying that our mums were together doing something.
Oh, I've got shivers. It
was wild. But we've had so many psychic things.
Just before we
met.
There's
no such thing that stuff can't just happen. Like, right? It's just too
well.
It's
like
too
you
weird.
said, there's no such thing as a coincidence. And we've had psychic mediums on our podcast before, and they've really drummed that home. And that there really is no such thing. Like we've had some really amazing signs happen to us as well. Like, yeah, we love it.
Well, okay. So let me ask you about, you're both moms, right? Am I wrong on that?
I'm a mom. Sal's a dog mom. She's definitely a mom, but she's got two cavalier.
Okay, so you're a dog mom. That counts. Yeah. That counts. My question was like I guess I'll ask you, Im. You were a new mom, right? Or were your kid? Okay, so you have one
9-month-old. I had a 9-month-old baby. Yeah.
Oh God. So you were dealing with that with a 9-month-old baby.
Yeah, I was still breastfeeding, just still really in the thick of it. And she wasn't a sleeper as well. So I was like in the trenches of like survival mode just from being a mum. And then I lost my mum. And yeah, my breast milk dried up. I couldn't like engage with my child. Like it was really, really hard. Yeah.
Well, that's what grief does to you, right? It's the physical part of grieving, like, you know, the crying, the trauma, and then on top of that being a mother and all your hormones and everything. I can't even imagine what that was like for you. I was going to ask, just, you know, being like your loved ones, like how did they feel about you two meeting and like going? I just was curious about that.
They were great.
Yeah, super supportive. Just, I think above anything, just glad that we'd found that person that could kind of be that support in a different way, like that grief support. And yeah, I think everyone was super, super supportive.
My partner was probably really happy because then I could talk to Sally about my grief all the time. Because he hadn't gone through a big loss, so he couldn't relate and he couldn't understand exactly what I was going through. So I think for him, having the weight taken off his shoulders was probably a massive relief.
But that's part of my point. It's like, you know, your loved ones, if you have a partner or husband or whatever it is, like for me right now, since he's in the very beginning stages of grieving, he's in shock, whatever. I don't like really know the right things to say. I'm afraid to like say the wrong thing, walk on eggshells, like the guilt, like all the things that the partner is like, what do we do? What do we say? How do, like, you know what I'm saying? So to be able to do what you both did, I think is really amazing. And then I wish I'm not sure if that program is all over the world, but it's such a good idea. If you are a listener and you are looking for support and you do want to find your Sally, maybe you both know about it. Can you share if you know anything about that?
Yeah, so there's actually, in the States specifically, there's an organization called the Dinner Party. Oh. It's nationwide, and they do online sort of grief events and meetups and virtual dinner parties. I'm not sure if they're doing in person, but they're a fantastic resource if you are looking for, you know, events. Obviously come and join our Good Mourning community as well. We have a global audience, and we have a lot of listeners that are based in the States. But if you're looking for that sort of support group, then check out the Dinner Party. Motherless Daughters do have a presence in the States. I think they do retreats, don't they, Im? And I think they do online events as well.
Yeah, run by Hope Edelman. And I think Claire Bidwell Smith as well joins her for those. And there's Modern Loss as well, which is a great resource in the States.
Did you both go into therapy like separately, like when this happened? Like, was that something? Because I know when one of you touched on and said, I was reading everything. I remember when you said that, I was like, I remember I went to Mexico, and this is when I lost Julie, and I just had a bunch of books on grief. And I was like, well, where do I even begin? And just, I couldn't even move because I lost her very suddenly and it was very bad the way she passed. And I didn't know how to like move forward. So that feeling that you both felt as well. And then the reading, but just being able to go, okay, like I need help. I need to go talk to somebody. I need to do something. And to be honest with you, at that point, I never did it. I think I went to one psychiatrist. This was like years ago, because I was like, well, I need to get put on an antidepressant. And it was a really bad idea for me at that time. Plus the therapist was not a good fit, which I talk about a lot, is making sure you're with the right therapist. How do you want to comment on that?
I think it's really common to not go and see someone straight away. I think it can be quite daunting, especially if people haven't, done therapy before. They don't know what to expect. They don't know where to begin. I have been seeing therapists for most of my life because I've suffered from anxiety since I was about 17. So therapy was not new to me. So I threw myself into it straight away. I knew what to do. I knew I needed to go and see my GP, put on a mental health plan so I could get subsidized sessions. And I had about 4 therapists around the clock because I didn't think that I was going to survive. And I was suffering from suicidal ideation as well after my mum died. So to make sure that didn't happen, I knew what I needed to do. And I was seeing a psychotherapist, a psychologist, a therapist that specializes in suicide loss. So my experience was very much like therapy heavy. Like it was the only thing that I think could kind of get me through at the start. I think it is important, like you mentioned, you know, you weren't clicking with your therapist back then. It's important to kind of shop around a bit because there's so many therapists out there, and you know, when you do find that right one, it's so beneficial. But there are a lot of therapists that, you know, you may not necessarily click with. So I think if anyone is struggling and stuck in their suffering, like I would highly recommend shopping around and speaking to your GP. And also you mentioned going on antidepressants. Like I was tossing up whether to do that as well. I have been on them before for my anxiety, but I made the decision not to, because doing all the work that we've done, you know, through grief, it's so important to feel
the
what
feeling.
You're feeling, as uncomfortable as it is. It's part of the process.
Absolutely. And I didn't seek therapy straight away. I almost needed just to get through the shock and kind of come to terms with what had happened. It was about 7 months into my journey for me that I decided I need to speak to someone. But like Im, I went to the doctor and I was like, I think I need to go on like antidepressants. Like I can't cope with this. And he said to me, grief, you know, you're grieving, and there are so many similarities, you know, a lot of people between depression and grief. So he advised against it, but I think it can be quite common. And
well, you know, I think that also for something I've said in the past, I say it a lot, that finding the right therapist is like dating, right?
Yeah.
Right? It's going on an app and dating, and you're like, I mean, I've like you, I've been in and out of therapy from my childhood, suffer from anxiety, and I've had some doozies of psychologists or whatever it be that I've gone to. And then one day, several years ago, I met my match, which is my therapist now. I'm actually not in therapy right now, but I was for the past probably 3 years. And I say it saved my life. And medication is something that's like a personal decision for me. I needed to be on something to get me through that really hard period. I'm not right now, but I love that you are open about talking about like how you were like, I need to do this. This is what I need to do. And honestly, it helps other people. And to have a plan is really important. Like when you're in such shock in the grieving process, it just happened. It's like, I say this a lot. It's like taking it step by step. Like step 1, this is what I'm going to do right now. Step 2, I'm going to go to the refrigerator and drink a bottle of Chardonnay. I'm not saying I did that, but yes, I did. You know, I mean, I'm kidding, but it's like, you know what it's like to be like in shock and you don't know what to do. And you don't know, you don't want to eat food. You don't want to get dressed. You don't want to do anything. You just want to like make the pain go away, you know?
Totally. And I think it's good to go micro in those moments. You know, it's literally one foot in front of the other. That is all you can do. And just back to your point, like about finding the right therapist, I think sometimes people might feel like unconfident to say, you know what, this isn't the right fit for me. But, you know, like we've all been through different and to see different therapists. And if it's not right, don't be afraid to go and find somebody else, because it's so important to have that connection. So important. And I think people can sometimes feel a bit afraid to make the change, or you kind of think, oh, well, this is it. Maybe I should just stick with this person. But if it's not helping, like one of the best things that you can do for yourself is shop elsewhere, so to speak.
And the other thing with grief is like it's so individual, you know, as you heard from Sal and I just then, like we had very different experiences with therapy, and we, you know, we're experiencing the same type of loss, our mum, similar ages, but our experiences of grief have been so different. And that's important to highlight, I think, because we can really judge ourselves too. We can be like, oh, should I be, you know, further along in my healing than I am now? Why is that person, you know, being able to go and see a therapist and I'm not? Like, I think we can be really hard on ourselves, but like, grief is so individual and no one's going to grieve in the same way. And that's really important for anyone listening as well to know, like, there's no right or wrong way to do this either. If you don't want to see a therapist, if it doesn't feel right for you, that's absolutely fine too. What helps for one person may not help for somebody else. But yeah, our experiences, therapy has been quite helpful.
Well, it's also the stages of grief. Like somebody might be in one stage for a prolonged period of time and another person skips right over a stage, but it hits them at a later point, you know? So
this is another thing. This is another thing that we've learned through the work that we do. Those 5 stages of grief, which are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, were never actually meant for the bereaved. So they were coined by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in the 1960s. She's a Swiss psychiatrist.
She's my favorite. I love her.
Yeah, she's amazing.
Yeah. I've read like her books on death and dying and The Wheel of Life. Like The Wheel of Life's like one of my favorite books of all time. But go on. Yeah.
So you probably already know this, but she had based that model on people who were dying, so people who were in palliative care. So they were never originally intended for people grieving the death of someone. And we interviewed David Kessler, who was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's protege, and he confirmed for us that they were never intended for the bereaved, and they were never meant to be a linear kind of, you know, path that a framework that people use when they're grieving the loss of someone, and they've been misinterpreted over the years. So people are thinking, you know, I'm not feeling acceptance, like I'm not there yet, but like acceptance isn't one big event. You know, you feel lots of little pieces of acceptance, which really just means that you're kind of coming to terms with what's happened. You don't accept, you know, what's actually happened, but so people can be really confused.
I never knew this, by the way. I've always talked about this stage of grief. That's it. Yeah. That actually, I like that you're saying that, because I think it's important actually not to say you're in whatever stage of grief, because you can circle back 10 years later and still be like, I'm mad. I'm angry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm so angry and I'm not accepting it. I mean, at some point you have to accept things because it's just part of life. You know, this is the worst part of life, right? But it's part of life. And I just learned something really big today.
Yay. Yay. I think another misconception with grief is that you feel sort of one emotion at a time. I think, you know, as we all know, you can feel so many things with grief, and it's not just sadness. But an interesting point on the whole acceptance, or the idea of acceptance, when we interviewed Hope Edelman, who is the author of several grief books. You've probably heard of her, Meghan, but she wrote Motherless Daughters, among many others. And we were talking about acceptance, and she said, like, a good way to think about acceptance in grief is more like a train station. And it's like something that you may arrive and depart from depending on what's going on in your life. So, for example, if something happens, like you become a new mum and you don't have your mum, or you get married, or there's some life event, you might find that you move kind of into grief a little bit more. And then you kind of move out of it and you accept what's happened. And then you kind of move to and from. It's not like a final destination. And I thought that was a really good way to look at it, because I think we don't necessarily always accept it, but we just learn to integrate it into our lives and live with it. But it's not this kind of final, like, right, I've accepted it and I've now moved on with my life. And I think that's really important to highlight, because people can put pressure on themselves to feel like you've got to reach some final point with grief. And it's just really not the case.
I think that's so important. And I love that you said that, because one of you, I don't know who told me they listened to my episode with my mom.
Me,
was that you,
yeah.
Sally? Okay.
Really
so
powerful.
Thank you, by the way. But I'm thinking about how hard that must have been for you to listen to that because of your own experience with losing your mother. For me, I lost my dad. So if I were to have listened to a podcast with a father and a daughter, for example, when I say ugly cry, I did start to ugly cry in the beginning of the episode, but I caught myself and I didn't ugly cry. But I'm shocked that I haven't. But I legitimately will like sob sometimes on these episodes because I am still grieving. And I don't think, like, hearing you say that about the train station and like that I don't need to be in these stages of like anger, whatever it is, I think is like eye-opening. And you've taught me so much today that I'm always gonna be in pain, or there's always gonna be a memory of, I mean, I lost my dad at 13, but I like, this is a story. One time I was in an airplane and I am very spiritual and like, kind of like, like feel things really deeply. And I was looking out. I'm a bad flyer, by the way, hate flying. And I looked out the wing and I saw my dad, like, not like there's a milkmaiden on the wing from Bridesmaids. Like I wasn't drinking, I was totally sober, but like, I looked in the reflection because I was such a bad flyer and so scared to fly. I saw my dad's face and I heard I heard his voice, and I hadn't heard his voice. This was several years ago, since I was like 12 years old, like hadn't, and I couldn't remember his voice, which I don't know if you have like voicemails or like you're dying to hear their voices, right? Anything you can like hold on to. And so it's interesting you say that because I will always be grieving, but I've gotten to a place where now I might cry a little bit, but I might also smile because I have that memory. And I really believe that was him talking to me. And then after that, honestly, I wasn't that afraid to fly anymore. Isn't that crazy?
How amazing.
Amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. It was the weirdest thing. It was one of the craziest like memories of my life. So
I love that.
And I wasn't drinking and I wasn't like on edibles. I was totally fine and sober. And that really happened. And I really believe that was him. So anyway, I'm trying to think like what I got like sidetracked by your story because I'm kind of in awe of the whole story with the train. Yeah.
I think it's so important, as you mentioned that, grief, it doesn't disappear, and I think people who haven't experienced loss can often think that it's just something we can tick off a to-do list. Like, oh, I've grieved, now I'm back to normal, or I've gotten over what's happened to me. But that's far from reality. And another thing that Hope Edelman taught us, she's written a book called The After Grief. So she's coined that term for like, you've got the initial raw grief, when it's just happened, that can even last for a couple of years, a few years, like the shock, all of that, while you try to come to terms with what's happened. And then you've got the after grief, which is the grief that you're left with for the rest of your life. And so when, big events happen and, moments like that on the plane, when you see your dad, or just anything that reminds you of your loss, like it is still grief. And as you mentioned, you may not be crying all the time, you may not be a mess on the floor, but you're still grieving, even if you're not crying, and I think people don't understand that unless they've gone through it themselves. So grief is a forever thing. It's not something that you'll ever get over. We learn to live with it, and that's just the reality of it.
Well, because we're never going to see them again. Like that's the reality, like holding on to a voicemail or like, recording that episode with my mom. Selfishly, I even said it in the episode, like someday I hope this will last so my kids can listen to it. And, and I would kill to have a recording like that with my dad, so let me pivot really quickly and ask you about, COVID and like, because to have to go through the losses that you went through during COVID, right? It was it was right before COVID, correct? So 2019.
Yeah.
Okay.
Late 2019 and early 2020.
Okay. So it was before lockdowns and everything.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mine was like on the cusp. I think maybe a week after Mum died, or it was probably like a month after Mum died, it went into lockdown. So it was like pretty early on.
The reason why I'm asking this is because this is a really, I think, important point. Why you decided you were like I say blessed, but blessed enough to be on the process of the grieving train, if you will, with each other. Mm-hmm. And then being in isolation in COVID and all the craziness of COVID, and then saying, well, what can we do? Like, what can we do with this? Like, what are we going to do? Are we going to like shut down and let ourselves be beaten up and like sit in our houses or our apartments? Or what are we going to do? Are we going to, let's start a podcast? How did that kind of go? Because that's kind of what happened to me. Like, my thing was like, somebody randomly, it was my therapist, was like, well, Meghan, you used to be an actress. Like, you're funny. Like, you should do something with this. And I was like, well, what do? I didn't even know what a podcast was. I had a friend that had a podcast. I called her. I was like, I want to start a podcast. She's like, you should. And that's literally how it happened. It was like me saying, I'm not going to let this take me down. I'm going to come back and I'm going to give back and I'm going to do this to help other people. Tell me about your experiences with that and like how you came up with the idea of the podcast.
Well, firstly, you're doing an amazing job. So it was meant to be that you were meant to start your pod. So I think we both found a lot of solace in listening to podcasts after our mums died, and obviously grieving in isolation during lockdown. It was a real, a bit of a lifeline to be able to hear the stories of others. And that's something that got us through, that connection and knowing that you're not alone in this. So when we became friends and we were talking about, how lonely grief is and all of the things that, are you going through this? And what about the exhaustion and, the anxiety and all the things that we don't really talk about? And we were kind of like, isn't it wild that we all go through grief? No one is exempt from it. We all experience it. Yet as a society, it's still quite taboo to talk about. So that was where we kind of decided, like, let's start a podcast that talks about grief, but with honesty, with humor, in the hope that it will help other people feel less alone in their grieving journey. We know that a lot of people were coping with loss because of COVID and because of, grieving in isolation. So let's do something that can help others, but talk about it in a way that's really honest and raw, much like your podcast, Meghan.
I love it. I love it. What about you, Im? Give me your feedback on that. I love interviewing two people, by the way. Kind of like a tennis match, right? Yeah. Go ahead.
Back onto the COVID lockdowns, like I was so traumatized that I couldn't even give COVID a thought, which is really crazy to think about. Like, I'm a worrier. I'm an overthinker. I get obsessed about the news and everything that's going on. But like, I was just not on this planet that I couldn't even comprehend what was happening with COVID, which is just, it's crazy to think about now. And I remember when I started to come out of the cloud of my grief and I was like, holy shit, like we've been living through this. Like this is, the magnitude of it is just horrendous. And I wasn't on this planet. So I think in a sense, like the lockdowns kind of helped me recluse a bit and not have to put on a brave face and go out and see the world and pretend like I was okay, because I was so far from okay. So that was my personal experience with grieving during a pandemic. And I guess like, yeah, on a selfish note, like doing the podcast for me gave me a lifeline, to be honest. Like I was so just, I just couldn't see a way out of my situation. I couldn't see the light. I couldn't see hope for the future. And Good Mourning gave me that. It gave me purpose. I'm going to get emotional. It gave me something to focus on. it gave me something to connect with my mum on a level that I could, just keep talking about her. And on a really selfish level, I think it saved my life doing this podcast. I didn't think I'd cry today.
That's what happened because I'm already crying too. But I'm going to tell you that you both are like, first of all, can we please be friends? I'm always friends. I've never interviewed somebody. I don't, knock on wood, watch me have like somebody come on that I have become friends with so many of my guests. And you both just inspire me so much. I cannot wait to listen to your podcast. Cause this was very last minute, by the way, for my audience. I had a spot open and Sally had reached out to me and we just connected and I was like, will you both come on? Like I have a slot that happened to open up. And so that's why I haven't listened. Usually I'll listen because I love what you're doing. And I think it's so important. And then on top of that, to turn around like like with your pain, like that's what I did. And Sally, that's what I did. And like for my listeners, like, sorry, I'm going to cry too. If you are in a dark place, like the three of us, and you are going through pain, there is always, like, I try to say this all the time, keep going, like keep going. And like, there's people out there, like there's the groups we talked about, the dinner party, mothers and daughters, motherless daughters. There's people out there and there's reasons to keep going and use your talents, use your gifts, use the ability to like your friendships or your hearts that you both have and the love that you have and the compassion, because you might be going through this loss right now, like Im or Sally, and you're living in a hopeless place. And then you go into a group or your coffee or whatever, and you never know, you might meet your friend's soulmate. So you got to keep going. And I am just beyond honored to meet you both. I love your accents. You both are the cutest things I've ever seen in my whole life. We're now best friends. I'm coming to Australia. I'm planning my trip right now. You better introduce me some cute surfers. Just kidding, I'm married. But I adore you both, and I'm so grateful for you coming on. And in closing, I say every podcast, be happy by making other people happy. My dad used to say it. And so you both are doing that. Keep doing the work. And it's an honor to know you.
Judging Meghan with Meghan Judge.